In the early summer of 455 AD, the heavy gates of Rome swung open, offering absolutely no resistance as the Vandal army marched directly into the undefended imperial capital. History remembers this invasion as the ultimate ruin of the Eternal City. Yet the true horror of this event lies in a chilling paradox. The most devastating sack of Rome was not a frenzied massacre or a chaotic riot. Unlike the disorganized three-day pillaging conducted by the Visigoths in 410 AD, the Vandal occupation was a cold, highly organized, 14-day bureaucratic extraction of wealth. Under the strict command of King Genseric, the Vandals didn't cross the Mediterranean to burn the capital to the ground in a fit of rage. They arrived to methodically liquidate its accumulated riches. Every sector of the city was systematically partitioned and stripped of its assets, from the treasuries of the Senate to the private vaults of the patrician elite. The defining sound of this catastrophe was not the clash of weapons, but the heavy metallic screech of iron pry bars ripping gilded bronze tiles from the roofs of state monuments. It was an operation executed with the terrifying efficiency of a tax collection at sword point, leaving the city financially and psychologically hollowed out. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the political assassination of Emperor Valentinian III that unraveled decades of peace, the profound cowardice of the usurper Emperor Petronius Maximus, who abandoned his post, and the precise logistics of the 14-day nightmare that permanently broke the Western Roman Empire. This catastrophe was not born from a sudden border incursion, but from the collapse of a delicate, decades-long diplomatic architecture. By the mid-5th century, the strategic balance of the Mediterranean had fundamentally shifted. The Vandals, a formidable Germanic tribe possessing an advanced naval capacity, had captured Carthage and established an independent kingdom in North Africa. This was not merely the loss of a province, it was the severing of Rome's primary economic artery. Carthage controlled the vast agricultural estates that produced the vital grain shipments required to feed the Italian peninsula. Without African grain, the imperial government could not sustain its urban population or reliably supply its remaining regular troops. Recognizing this stark geopolitical reality, Emperor Valentinian III was forced to negotiate rather than fight. In 442 AD, he signed a landmark peace treaty with the Vandal king, Genseric. This treaty effectively recognized Vandal sovereignty over North Africa and established a pragmatic, albeit fragile, coexistence. To cement this pact, Valentinian eventually betrothed his own daughter, Eudoxia, to Genseric's son, Honoric. For King Genseric, an astute and highly calculating ruler, the peace was guaranteed not by the Roman Senate or the abstract authority of the state, but by a personal bond with the reigning emperor. The stability of the entire Western Mediterranean rested squarely on the pulse of one man. However, the internal politics of the imperial household proved infinitely more treacherous than any foreign adversary. In March 455 AD, the sudden sharp scrape of drawn iron on the training grounds of the Campus Martius marked the abrupt assassination of Emperor Valentinian III by mutinous guards. The violent death of the emperor instantly dismantled the geopolitical framework that had kept the Vandal fleet at bay. When the news of the assassination reached the royal court at Carthage, Genseric made a strict legalistic assessment of the situation. His treaty of 442 AD had been sworn with Valentinian personally. With the emperor murdered, the pact was officially void, and the political legitimacy of the Roman state was suddenly entirely open to exploitation. The Vandal king did not issue orders to mobilize his fleet out of blind, opportunistic aggression. He mobilized because the imperial capital had just willfully stripped itself of its only diplomatic shield. The machinery of the Roman state had fractured, leaving a dangerous void at the highest level of command. The power vacuum in Rome would immediately be filled by a man whose political ambition vastly exceeded his administrative competence, triggering a fatal chain reaction that would soon bring the Vandal ships directly to the mouth of the Tiber. The man who stepped into the blood-stained void was Petronius Maximus, a wealthy and fiercely ambitious Roman senator. Taking the title of emperor required more than simply declaring oneself the master of the state. In the rigid political structure of the late empire, true legitimacy remained anchored to the surviving members of the Theodosian dynasty. Maximus possessed vast financial resources, but he lacked the vital imperial bloodline necessary to command the unquestioned loyalty of the Senate and the fragmented Western armies. To solve this structural deficit, he executed a ruthless political maneuver. Within days of Valentinian's murder, Maximus forced the grieving widow, the Empress Eudoxia, into a sudden marriage. The union was entirely transactional, a mechanism to physically graft himself onto the ruling family. As the heavy, suffocating layers of the imperial purple were draped over her shoulders for the ceremony, Eudoxia knew she was being bound to the very man widely suspected of orchestrating her husband's assassination. Trapped within the sprawling confines of the palatial estate, the Empress found herself profoundly isolated. Her guards answered to Maximus, her political allies were neutralized, and her daughters were now effectively hostages to the usurper's ambition. However, Eudoxia was not a passive victim. She was a hardened political actor born into the highest echelons of Roman power. She understood the cold arithmetic of survival. To purge a domestic usurper who had entirely compromised the imperial administration, she required an overwhelming external force. She needed a hammer capable of shattering Maximus's bought alliances before his regime could fully entrench itself in Italy. Casting her strategic gaze across the Mediterranean, the Empress made a calculated, desperate geopolitical play. She bypassed the compromised Roman Senate and smuggled a direct correspondence to Carthage, appealing directly to King Genseric. This was not a reckless act of treason against the concept of Rome, but a highly targeted factional strike. Eudoxia leveraged the fact that her daughter, Eudoxia, was already officially betrothed to Genseric's son under the previous treaty. By formally requesting Vandal intervention, she handed the Vandal king the ultimate diplomatic weapon, the perfect legal and moral pretext to sail on Italy. He would not be arriving as a foreign conqueror, but as the requested savior of the true imperial family, coming to avenge a murdered ally and rescue a captive empress. The letter successfully slipped past the harbor guards and crossed the sea to the shores of North Africa. In Carthage, Genseric absorbed the intelligence and recognized the monumental vulnerability of the Italian peninsula, while Emperor Petronius Maximus remained in the capital, feverishly distributing bribes from the treasury to consolidate his precarious grip on the throne. He was entirely blind to the strategic reality gathering to the south. He had no idea that a single piece of smuggled correspondence had already reached the Vandal court, setting into motion a highly equipped fleet that the fractured Roman state had absolutely no naval capacity to stop. In late May 455 AD, the Vandal fleet materialized off the Italian coast, dropping anchor at Portus and Ostia, the vital maritime gateways at the mouth of the Tiber River. For the Roman administration, this was the realization of their ultimate logistical terror. They were facing a massive amphibious assault by a highly organized foreign state against a capital that had entirely lost its outer defensive perimeter and naval screening forces. Carthage, once a subdued province serving as the breadbasket of the empire, was now projecting overwhelming naval supremacy straight into Italy's throat. The rhythmic mechanical splash of thousands of oars striking the water as the Vandal transports confidently navigated the coastal shallows signaled the definitive end of Roman dominance in the Mediterranean basin. As verified reports of the hostile landing raced the 16 miles up the Via Ostiensis, absolute panic consumed the Eternal City. The Senate and the civilian populace immediately looked to the Palatine Hill for definitive leadership, anticipating the rapid mobilization of the urban garrison and the strict fortification of the towering Aurelian walls. Instead, they found an imperial administration in total freefall. Emperor Petronius Maximus, the man who had ruthlessly manipulated his way to the highest office, instantly buckled under the crushing pressure of actual military command. Recognizing that he had no loyal field army stationed in Italy and no allied Germanic tribes marching to his relief, Maximus made a catastrophic executive calculation. He issued absolutely no orders for a cohesive siege defense. Instead, he formally advised the Senate to abandon the imperial capital, mounting his horse with the explicit intention to flee northward and leave the citizens to the mercy of King Genseric. This profound display of command cowardice violently shattered the last remaining vestiges of civil order. A Roman emperor openly abandoning his post in the face of an advancing foreign army was a structural betrayal the populace simply could not stomach. As Petronius Maximus attempted to ride out of the city gates on May 31st, his royal entourage was swiftly intercepted by a furious, desperate mob comprised of civilians and mutinous garrison troops. The sacred aura of the imperial purple, which had historically protected the physical person of the ruler, dissolved in an instant. The citizens, realizing the state had effectively sacrificed them to buy time for the elite, abruptly transformed into executioners. The atmosphere was shattered by the dull thud of heavy paving stones and the chaotic roar of a leaderless, terrified populace echoing against the marble facades of the urban center. Petronius Maximus was violently pulled from his horse and mercilessly stoned to death in the street. To complete the absolute indignity of his brief, disastrous reign, his mangled body was torn apart, dragged through the dirt, and unceremoniously hurled into the dark currents of the Tiber River. The sudden execution of the usurper solved nothing for the trapped and terrified citizens. It merely accelerated the absolute collapse of the central government. In a matter of hours, Rome had become a fully decapitated state. There was no reigning emperor, no supreme field commander, and absolutely no centralized military structure remaining to coordinate a physical defense or even draft terms of surrender. The wealthiest and most symbolically significant metropolis in the Western world had violently purged its own leadership, leaving its heavy iron gates entirely undefended as King Genseric and the Vandal army began their steady, unresisted march up the Via Ostiensis. As the Vandal vanguard approached the ancient perimeter of Rome, they encountered an eerie, unprecedented silence. The imperial administration had dissolved, the military command was non-existent, and the usurper's corpse was washing out to the Tyrrhenian Sea. With the Senate paralyzed and the urban cohorts scattered, the civic structure of the Eternal City had completely failed. Into this absolute secular void stepped the only remaining pillar of organized institutional authority, Pope Leo I, the Bishop of Rome. Accompanied only by unarmed clergy rather than armored centurions, the bishop walked out of the city gates not to fight, but to broker a desperate compromise. The meeting between the Bishop of Rome and the Vandal king was not a miraculous religious intervention. It was a cold, high-stakes diplomatic negotiation between two supreme pragmatists. Genseric stood at the height of his physical and military power, commanding a hardened expeditionary force that could easily have reduced the capital to ash within hours. Pope Leo possessed no swords, but he deeply understood the brutal arithmetic of siege warfare. He recognized that Rome's massive defensive walls were entirely meaningless without a loyal garrison to man them, and that any frantic attempt at civilian resistance would only trigger a retaliatory massacre. The bishop made a ruthless calculation, offering the total surrender of Roman dignity and imperial prestige in exchange for the basic survival of its people. The resulting pact was a stark reflection of the new balance of power in the Mediterranean. Pope Leo formally traded the accumulated physical wealth of the Western Empire to preserve its biological capital. Genseric agreed to a strict set of terms. His troops would not slaughter the civilian population, they would not torture the residents, and they would not burn the city's architecture. In exchange, the heavy gates of Rome were thrown completely open. The citizens watched in terrified, breathless silence as thousands of armed Vandal infantrymen marched unopposed over the worn cobblestones, their heavy boots echoing steadily through the thoroughfares without a single Roman weapon drawn in defiance. The capital of the Western world was officially handed over to a foreign king without a single casualty on the ramparts. To the trembling senators and commoners huddled in their homes, the pact felt like a temporary deliverance. They had successfully avoided the frenzied, blood-soaked slaughter that typically accompanied the fall of an ancient metropolis. As the populace exhaled a collective breath of relief, believing they had weathered the worst of the crisis, they gravely underestimated their enemy. The Romans expected a chaotic, disorganized raid driven by temporary tribal plunder. They had absolutely no concept of the sheer, terrifying bureaucratic efficiency of the logistical nightmare that was about to unfold. On June 2nd, 455 AD, the Vandal army formally took possession of the imperial capital, initiating an occupation that would last for exactly 14 days, concluding on June 16th. For the Roman patricians who remembered the histories of previous invasions, the methodical nature of this occupying force was deeply unsettling. 45 years earlier, in 410 AD, Alaric and his Visigoths had breached the city, resulting in a 3-day frenzy of disorganized pillaging, burning, and chaos before the invaders quickly moved on. King Genseric's approach was fundamentally different. He did not view Rome as a battlefield to be razed, but as a vast, static treasury waiting to be systematically audited and emptied. The 14-day duration was not a result of slow or hesitant plundering. It was a carefully calculated time frame required to execute one of the largest logistical transfers of wealth in the ancient world. To extract the maximum possible value from a sprawling metropolis, Genseric imposed iron discipline upon his ranks. The Vandal troops were strictly forbidden from engaging in the chaotic, destructive rioting that typically destroyed the very assets an army sought to claim. Instead, the looting functioned as a highly regulated military operation. The city was meticulously partitioned into sectors, with specific detachments assigned to clear designated districts under the watchful eyes of their officers. Elite units were dispatched directly to the Palatine Hill to strip the imperial palaces, while other cohorts systematically worked their way through the wealthy patrician estates of the Aventine and Caelian hills. It was a bureaucratic extraction executed at the point of a sword, where Roman administrators were likely coerced into handing over tax ledgers and vault manifests to ensure no hidden reserve was overlooked by the occupiers. The sheer mechanics of this operation required an unbroken, highly efficient supply chain. The wealth of the Western Roman Empire could not be carried away in the pockets of infantrymen. Instead, Genseric's quartermasters commandeered every available wagon, cart, and beast of burden within the region. A relentless convoy system was established, connecting the heart of the city to the port of Ostia, where the massive Vandal transport fleet sat at anchor. For 2 solid weeks, the defining sensory reality of the occupation was the heavy, rhythmic groaning of overloaded wooden axles as thousands of carts trundled continuously down the Via Ostiensis. As one fleet of ships was filled to capacity with silver bullion, imperial coinage, and precious silks, it would prepare to depart, replaced immediately by empty vessels waiting to receive the next heavy shipment of Roman heritage. The unprecedented length of the occupation is what made it uniquely devastating to the imperial economy. A 3-day raid limits an army to surface-level plunder, taking only what can be easily grabbed and carried by a rushing soldier. A 14-day operation, backed by thousands of organized troops and a secure maritime supply line, provides the time necessary for deep, structural extraction. the Vandals had the luxury of time to pry open sealed subterranean vaults, dismantle heavy palace furniture, and strip the accumulated wealth of centuries from the public baths and basilicas. They methodically targeted the massive public reserves of bronze and precious metals that sustained the city's remaining economic infrastructure. By maintaining absolute control over the streets and preventing any localized uprisings, Genseric's forces operated with the unhurried precision of engineers decommissioning a bankrupt enterprise. By the end of the first week, the subterranean treasuries of the state were hollowed out. The patrician villas had been entirely stripped of their heirlooms, and the vast storehouses of imperial wealth were empty. Yet, the Vandal quartermasters knew that the true wealth of the Eternal City was not merely locked behind heavy doors or buried in aristocratic gardens. Having exhausted the easily accessible vaults on the ground, Genseric's engineers simply shifted their gaze upward, fixing their eyes on the massive gilded monuments that had defined the Roman skyline for centuries. Their primary target was the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, the ancient religious and political epicenter of the Roman state. This was not a chaotic smash-and-grab operation. It was a deliberate dismantling of imperial prestige. Scaffolding was erected, and soldiers were repurposed into demolition crews. The defining action of this phase was the heavy grinding labor of iron pry bars wrenching massive gilded bronze tiles from the temple's roof, slowly exposing the ancient timber framework beneath to the open sky. By stripping the very roof off the house of Rome's chief deity, King Genseric delivered a devastating psychological blow, providing a highly visible declaration to the remaining populace that the Roman gods were entirely impotent to protect their own sanctuary, let alone the empire. With the temples of the old gods compromised, the occupation forces systematically moved to appropriate the historical trophies of the emperors. Deep within the state vaults lay the sacred Jewish relics, most notably the solid gold menorah, which had been triumphantly paraded through the streets of Rome nearly 4 centuries earlier. In 70 AD, Emperor Titus had brought these artifacts back from the brutal sack of Jerusalem, utilizing the immense wealth of that conquest to fund the construction of the Colosseum and solidify the Flavian dynasty. For hundreds of years, these relics remained untouched, serving as tangible proof of Rome's invincibility and its absolute supremacy over the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, the Vandals meticulously cataloged and loaded these very same artifacts onto ox-drawn carts, treating the sacred history of the Roman Empire as mere cargo to be hauled to the docks. The removal of these specific relics carried a profound historical irony that fundamentally redefined the balance of global power. The spoils of Rome's greatest first-century victory were actively being transformed into the spoils of its ultimate 5th-century humiliation. Furthermore, the destination of this looted heritage amplified the geopolitical insult. The menorah, the gilded bronze of Jupiter, and the silver of the patricians were all being shipped directly to Carthage. The African metropolis, which the Roman Republic had famously burned to the ground and eradicated during the Punic Wars to ensure its own survival, had not only risen from the ashes, but was now systematically feeding off the carcass of its ancient conqueror. The physical dismantling of Rome's monuments was the literal erasure of its imperial legacy, signaling to the world that the capital was no longer the untouchable center of the earth. As the 14-day timeline drew to a close, and the heavy transport ships sitting at Ostia rode low in the water under the immense weight of the plundered metal, the operation entered its final phase. Yet, King Genseric was not satisfied with merely taking gold, bronze, and silver to enrich his newly established kingdom. He understood that true geopolitical supremacy required more than financial ruin. His final targets were the living, breathing symbols of Roman legitimacy. To secure his political leverage over whatever fractured government would emerge from the ashes, Genseric ordered the capture of Empress Liciniia Eudoxia and her 2 daughters, Eudocia and Placidia. This abduction was not an act of arbitrary vengeance, but a highly calculated geopolitical stroke. By taking the surviving members of the Theodosian dynasty into custody, the Vandal king acquired the ultimate diplomatic hostages. He explicitly intended to enforce the original 442 AD treaty by marrying the young Eudoxia to his own heir, Genseric. This masterstroke of dynastic engineering would soon inject legitimate Roman imperial blood directly into the Vandal royal line, ensuring that the court at Carthage held permanent, undeniable leverage over the imperial administration in Italy. The heavy, rhythmic creaking of the wooden gangways at Ostia served as the grim soundtrack to this transfer of power, as the highest-ranking women of the empire were quietly escorted onto the Vandal flagship. Alongside the imperial family, the occupying forces orchestrated a massive, highly regulated extraction of human capital. Thousands of skilled Roman citizens, including master artisans, engineers, and literate administrative bureaucrats, were systematically rounded up and marched under heavy guard down the 16-mile stretch of the Via Ostiensis toward the waiting fleet. In the ruthless arithmetic of late antique warfare, these individuals were not merely incidental prisoners of war. They were critical economic infrastructure. The newly independent Vandal kingdom required advanced, skilled labor to manage its rapidly expanding maritime empire and to maintain the vast, lucrative agricultural estates of North Africa. By forcibly relocating this educated workforce, Genseric effectively crippled the administrative and productive capacity of the Italian peninsula, while simultaneously supercharging his own North African economy. It was a massive, involuntary transfer of human resources, explicitly designed to guarantee that the capital could not easily rebuild its civic or naval strength. On June 16, 455 AD, exactly 14 days after they had entered the undefended gates, the Vandal army seamlessly concluded its logistical operation. The massive transport fleet, now riding perilously low in the water under the immense combined weight of Roman bullion, stripped architectural bronze, and thousands of human captives, caught the favorable summer winds and sailed south toward Carthage. Behind them, they left a metropolis that had been financially decapitated and structurally humiliated. The sheer volume of material and personnel taken in those 2 weeks permanently shifted the balance of power across the Mediterranean basin. As the dust finally settled over the harbor roads and the distant sails vanished over the horizon, a profound, unnatural silence fell over the stripped, hollowed-out capital. It was a heavy, lingering quiet that forced the surviving senators to confront a fatal, inescapable question. Having been entirely drained of its treasury, its African grain, and its legitimate imperial bloodline, could the Western Roman Empire ever truly recover from this wound? History has a twisted sense of memory. Centuries after the Vandal fleet departed the Italian coast, the term vandalism would be coined during the French Revolution to describe mindless, senseless destruction. The profound irony is that King Genseric's operation in 455 AD was the exact opposite of unthinking chaos. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic logistical extraction. However, the sheer scale of the theft, encompassing the systematic stripping of the temple roofs, the abduction of the Empress, and the hollowing out of the civil administration, left a trauma so deep on the European psyche that the Vandal name became forever synonymous with the absolute ruin of civilization. The true devastation of the 14-day occupation was not architectural, but entirely economic and political. Stripped of its vast central treasury and permanently denied the agricultural output of Carthage, the imperial administration in Italy was fundamentally bankrupted. A state cannot field professional, standing legions without gold to pay them and African grain to feed them. Consequently, the central government was forced into absolute military dependence on allied Germanic tribes, essentially outsourcing its own survival to foreign mercenaries. The sacred prestige of the emperor, irrevocably shattered by the earlier cowardice of Petronius Maximus and the abduction of the Theodosian bloodline, completely evaporated. The Vandal sack did not just take Rome's wealth, it severed the underlying economic tendons that allowed the Western Empire to stand. The 2 decades that followed were merely a prolonged, agonizing death rattle. A succession of shadow emperors and military strongmen attempted to hold the fractured pieces of Italy together, but the geopolitical center of gravity had permanently shifted. The direct line of cause and effect from the Vandal fleet, weighing anchor in 455 AD, leads inexorably to 476 AD, when the Germanic commander Eudoxia formally deposed the final Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, without even needing to fight a major war. The western half of the empire did not fall in a single apocalyptic clash of steel. It quietly starved to death after being surgically drained of its resources. Rome had survived foreign incursions before, but this 14-day extraction delivered the fatal wound. It stands as a grim historical testament to how swiftly a 1,000-year civilization can be systematically dismantled when its political core rots and its logistical arteries are severed. In exactly 2 weeks, an organized rival state converted the undisputed capital of the ancient world into an empty, echoing monument to its own vanished supremacy. Please subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.